Elena, I need to talk to you about something important, my father-in-law William said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gestured for me to sit beside him on the porch swing. The October breeze carried the scent of dying leaves, and something in his tone made my stomach clench with worry. At 83, William had been battling pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and we all knew his time was running short. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, something the family doesn't know yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wraparound porch of the family estate in Millbrook, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been in the Harrison family for 4 generations. I had married into this family 5 years ago, and while I'd grown to love William dearly, his 3 biological children had never quite accepted me. My husband David was the youngest of the Harrison children, and according to his older siblings, Rebecca and Jonathan, I was nothing more than a gold digger who had trapped their baby brother with my charm and ambition. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, his blue eyes, so much like David's, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Elena, in all my years, I've learned that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters, who cares without expecting anything in return, and who treats an old man with dignity even when he becomes a burden. I felt tears prick my eyes as I remembered the countless hours I'd spent with William over the past months. While Rebecca lived just 20 minutes away and Jonathan resided in the family's second home across town, neither had visited more than a handful of times since William's diagnosis. David, though well-meaning, was always consumed with his work at the investment firm, leaving me to drive William to his chemotherapy appointments, sit with him during his treatments, and keep him company during the long, painful nights when sleep eluded him. "William, you're not a burden," I whispered, taking his frail hand in mine. "You're family." He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. "That's exactly why I've made this decision, sweetheart. Elena, I'm leaving you $2 million in my will. The house, the rest of the estate, that'll go to my children as expected. But this money, it's for you. You've been more of a daughter to me in these past 5 years than either Rebecca or Jonathan have been in decades." I stared at him in shock, my mouth falling open. $2 million was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Growing up in a modest household with my single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, I'd learned the value of every penny. Even now, working as a high school English teacher, my salary barely covered my personal expenses, and I often relied on David's income for our shared household costs. "William, I can't accept that," I stammered. "That's your children's inheritance. They'll never forgive me, and David will be caught in the middle." William's expression hardened slightly. "Elena, I've watched my children for 60 years. Rebecca thinks she's entitled to everything because she's the oldest and a woman. She's been planning how to spend my money since her mother died 10 years ago. Jonathan, a corporate lawyer who drives a different luxury car every year, has once asked David point blank if he'd gotten a prenup, suggesting that I might leave him once I'd gotten what I came for." "What does David know about this?" I asked quietly. William shook his head. "Nothing yet. I wanted to tell you first because I know this is going to cause a storm, and I wanted you to be prepared. My children are going to be furious, Elena. They're going to say terrible things about you, and they're going to pressure David to contest the will or to convince you to give the money back." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Maybe I should just refuse it now before anyone gets hurt. "Absolutely not," William said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a successful businessman for over 50 years. "Elena, do you know why I'm giving this to you? It's not just because you've taken care of me, though that means more to me than you'll ever know. It's because you're the only one in this family who doesn't expect anything from me. You're the only one who visits because you want to spend time with me, not because you're worried about staying in my good graces for inheritance purposes." He gestured toward the grand house behind us, with its perfectly manicured gardens and 3-car garage filled with classic automobiles. "I built all of this from nothing, Elena. I started with a small construction company and turned it into a real estate empire. But more than that, I built what I thought was a family legacy. I wanted my children to understand the value of hard work, of treating people with respect, of giving back to the community that supported us. William's voice grew sad. Rebecca sees dollar signs when she looks at me. She's already been asking about selling the house, about liquidating the art collection, about cashing out the stock portfolio. Jonathan treats our family gatherings like business networking events, always angling for connections or investment opportunities. And David, sweet as he is, has never challenged either of them when they speak poorly of you. That last observation hit me like a physical blow because it was absolutely true. David loved me, I had no doubt about that, but he'd grown up as the youngest child in a family where keeping the peace meant not making waves. When Rebecca made her cutting remarks about my background, or Jonathan questioned my motives for marrying into the family, David would change the subject or make a joke rather than defend me directly. "I've been thinking about this for over a year," William continued. "Ever since that Christmas dinner when Rebecca suggested that you and David should reconsider having children because it might be financially irresponsible given your teaching salary. Do you remember that?" I remembered it vividly. Rebecca had made the comment after her third glass of wine, ostensibly as part of a conversation about family planning, but the implication was clear. She thought I wasn't financially worthy of bringing Harrison grandchildren into the world. Jonathan had laughed and made a joke about teacher salaries, while David had simply looked uncomfortable and steered the conversation towards sports. "I remember," I said quietly. "That night, I realized that my daughter saw you as a threat to her inheritance, not as a member of our family. And I realized that I had failed as a father if I raised children who judge people's worth based on their bank accounts." William reached into his jacket again and pulled out a second envelope, this one smaller and sealed. "This is a letter I've written to be read at the will reading. It explains my decision and makes it clear that this bequest is non-negotiable and legally binding. I've also included some observations about the way my children have treated you over the years and my disappointment in their behavior." I felt a mixture of gratitude and terror at the thought of that letter being read aloud in front of the entire Harrison family. "William, this is going to destroy my relationship with Rebecca and Jonathan forever."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He studied my face carefully. "Elena, what relationship? Has Rebecca ever invited you to lunch without David present? Has Jonathan ever asked about your work or your interests without it being purely perfunctory? They tolerate you because you're married to David, but they've never accepted you as family. This inheritance might make their dislike more obvious, but it's not going to change what already exists." As much as I hated to admit it, William was absolutely right. 5 years of marriage, and I could count on one hand the number of genuine conversations I'd had with David's siblings. They included me in family events out of obligation, but I was always made to feel like an outsider looking in on their shared history and inside jokes. "There's something else," William said, his tone becoming more serious. "I need you to promise me that you won't tell anyone about this conversation until after the will is read, not even David. This decision needs to come from me, and I want to be the one to face whatever consequences arise." I nodded slowly, though every fiber of my being wanted to rush home and tell David everything. We'd built our marriage on a foundation of honesty and communication, and keeping this secret felt like a betrayal of those principles. "Good," William said, visibly relieved. "The reading is scheduled for next Wednesday at Patterson and Associates. I've already spoken with Henry Patterson, and he understands that this bequest might come as a surprise to the family." Over the following weeks, as William's condition deteriorated rapidly, I found myself carrying the weight of his secret while simultaneously managing my grief at watching this wonderful man fade away. David was struggling with his father's decline, and I wanted desperately to comfort him with the knowledge that his father had found such a meaningful way to express his love for our family. But I'd made a promise, and I intended to keep it. William passed away peacefully on a Thursday morning in November, with David and me holding his hands while Rebecca and Jonathan were stuck in traffic on their way to the hospital. His final words were directed at me. "Remember what we talked about on the porch, sweetheart. You deserve every happiness in this world. The funeral was a grand affair, befitting a man who had been a pillar of the community for decades. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, from construction workers who had worked for William's company 40 years ago to business leaders and local politicians who had benefited from his mentorship and generosity. Rebecca had taken charge of the arrangements, making sure everything was perfect and expensive, while Jonathan handled the logistics and media attention with his usual corporate efficiency. During the service, I couldn't help but notice how Rebecca and Jonathan spoke about their father in past tense, as if his death was primarily significant because of how it affected them. Rebecca's eulogy focused heavily on how William had provided for his family and built a lasting legacy, while Jonathan spoke about continuing his father's business philosophy and maintaining his professional relationships. When I was invited to speak, I talked about the man I'd known over the past 5 years, someone who still remembered the names of every worker who had ever been employed by his company, who donated anonymously to scholarships for underprivileged children, who spent his final months worrying more about everyone else's well-being than his own pain. I saw several people in the audience wiping away tears, but Rebecca and Jonathan looked impatient, as if my personal memories were somehow inappropriate for such a formal occasion. The week between the funeral and the will reading passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors, thank you card writing, and David's attempts to sort through his father's personal belongings. Rebecca had already begun making plans for the house, suggesting that they should get it appraised immediately and consider whether it made sense to sell it or turn it into rental property. Jonathan was focused on understanding the business assets and investment portfolios, muttering about tax implications and market conditions. David seemed overwhelmed by his siblings' intensity and grateful that I was handling most of the day-to-day details like returning borrowed items to neighbors and organizing William's extensive library. Neither Rebecca nor Jonathan offered to help with these smaller tasks, apparently considering them beneath their attention. On the morning of the will reading, I woke up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with anticipation. David was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the same troubled expression he'd worn for days. "I keep thinking about everything Dad accomplished," he said quietly. "The business, this house, all the jobs he created over the years. It feels like so much responsibility." I turned to face him, wishing I could ease his worry with the knowledge that his father's final act had been one of love rather than burden. "Your father was proud of all 3 of you," I said carefully. "Whatever he decided about the estate, it came from a place of love and thoughtfulness." David squeezed my hand. "I just hope Rebecca and Jonathan don't fight over everything. Dad always hated conflict, and I can't stand the thought of his death causing family drama. If only he knew what was coming." We arrived at the law offices of Patterson and Associates at precisely 2 o'clock, joining Rebecca and Jonathan in a mahogany-paneled conference room that smelled of leather and old books. Henry Patterson, William's longtime attorney and friend, greeted us with the somber professionalism appropriate for the occasion. "Before we begin," Henry said, settling behind his desk with William's file, "I want to remind everyone that your father spent considerable time crafting this will. Every decision was made deliberately and with great thought for each of you and for his legacy." Rebecca shifted impatiently in her chair. "Of course, Henry, we understand that Dad was very thorough about everything." Jonathan nodded in agreement. "We're prepared for whatever provisions he made. I assume the primary assets, the house, the business interests, the investment accounts, will be divided among the 3 children according to standard practices." Henry's expression remained carefully neutral. "William's will does follow some traditional patterns, but there are also some provisions that might come as a surprise. I'll ask that everyone please hold their questions until I've read through the entire document." I felt my heart rate accelerate as Henry opened the thick folder and began to read. The first several pages were exactly what everyone expected. The house and surrounding property would be divided equally among Rebecca, Jonathan, and David, along with William's extensive art collection and most of his investment portfolio. Rebecca looked satisfied, Jonathan was already taking notes on his phone, and David simply looked relieved that the division seemed fair and uncomplicated. Then Henry reached the section that would change everything. "To my daughter-in-law Elena Martinez Harrison, who has shown me more kindness, respect, and genuine affection in 5 years than I have received from some others in decades, I leave the sum of $2 million to be transferred to her individual account with no restrictions or conditions. This bequest is made in recognition of her character, her dedication to our family, and my sincere belief that she embodies the values I have tried to instill in all of my children." The silence in the room was deafening. I felt every eye turn toward me, and I could practically hear the gears turning in Rebecca and Jonathan's nuthins as they processed what they just heard. Henry continued reading. "I have also prepared a letter explaining this decision, which I have requested be read aloud as part of these proceedings." Rebecca found her voice first. "I'm sorry, Henry, but did you just say that Elena is receiving $2 million? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Henry replied calmly. "This provision was added to the will 14 months ago and has been reviewed and confirmed multiple times since then." Jonathan leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Henry, you know as well as I do that undue influence can invalidate bequests like this. If Elena convinced my father to change his will while he was sick and vulnerable—" "I would be very careful about making accusations like that," Henry interrupted sharply. "Your father was of completely sound mind when he made this decision, and I have extensive documentation of our conversations about it. He was also very specific about potential challenges to this bequest." David looked like he'd been hit by a truck. He stared at me with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hurt. "Elena, did you know about this?" I met his eyes steadily, remembering William's final words and his request that I not tell anyone about our conversation. "Your father mentioned that he was planning to leave me something, but I had no idea it would be this much. I actually tried to talk him out of it." Rebecca's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You tried to talk him out of it? That implies you discussed it at length, which means you absolutely knew about this and said nothing." "Rebecca, please," David said quietly, but his sister was just getting started. "This is exactly what I warned everyone about from the beginning," Rebecca continued, her voice rising. "Elena shows up, plays the devoted daughter-in-law, and walks away with $2 million of our father's money that should have been divided among his actual children." I felt a flash of anger at the implication that I wasn't part of the family, but I kept my voice level. "I understand that this is shocking, Rebecca, but your father made this decision on his own. I never asked for anything." Jonathan had been furiously typing on his phone while his sister spoke. "Henry, I want to see all the documentation related to this bequest. Every conversation, every revision, every witness statement. If there's even a hint that Elena manipulated our father—" "That's enough," Henry said firmly. "I'm going to read William's letter now, and I suggest you all listen carefully because it addresses exactly these concerns." He pulled out a single sheet of paper and cleared his throat. "To my children and my beloved daughter-in-law, Elena. If you are hearing this letter, it means that my bequest to Elena has come as a surprise, and I suspect that Rebecca and Jonathan are already questioning both Elena's character and my mental competency. Let me address both issues directly." Henry paused, and I could see Rebecca and Jonathan exchanging glances. "First, Elena is one of the most honest, hardworking, and genuinely caring people I have ever known. In the 5 years she has been part of our family, she has never asked me for anything. Not money, not favors, not connections, not gifts. When I offered to help her pay off her student loans 3 years ago, she politely declined. When I suggested that she and David should let me help with a down payment for a house, she insisted that they wanted to save up and buy something on their own. The only thing Elena has ever accepted from me is my friendship, and she has given far more than she has received." I felt tears burning my eyes as I remembered all of those conversations. William had been so generous with his offers of help, and I had turned them down because I wanted to make sure that David and I built our life together based on our own efforts, not his family's wealth. "Second, I am leaving Elena this money precisely because she doesn't expect it and doesn't feel entitled to it. I have watched my biological children assume that my assets were their birthright, planning how to spend money that wasn't yet theirs, treating my death as a business opportunity rather than a personal loss." Rebecca gasped audibly, and Jonathan's face had gone white with anger. Rebecca, you have spent the past 10 years asking me about your inheritance, suggesting that I should sell assets now and give you advanced distributions, and making it clear that you view my death primarily as a financial event. You have visited me fewer than 12 times since my cancer diagnosis, and most of those visits involved discussions about estate planning or your concerns about Elena's influence on the family. I watched Rebecca's expression crumble as her father's words hit their mark. Jonathan, you have treated me like a business contact rather than a parent for most of your adult life. Our conversations revolve around investment strategies, tax implications, and networking opportunities. You have asked me to introduce you to potential clients more often than you have asked about my health, my fears, or my hopes for the family's future. Jonathan slammed his hand on the conference table. This is ridiculous. Dad was clearly not thinking straight. Elena, obviously. Henry held up his hand for silence and continued reading. And David, my dear youngest son, while you have never been calculating about my money, you have also never stood up for Elena when your siblings have treated her poorly. You have allowed them to make her feel like an outsider in our family because you don't want to create conflict. But sometimes, son, avoiding conflict means enabling injustice. David's face went pale, and I could see the truth of his father's words hitting him like a physical blow. Elena has been the daughter I never had. She has listened to my stories, remembered my friends' names, accompanied me to doctor appointments, and treated me with dignity even when I became irritable and demanding during the worst of my illness. She has earned this bequest through her character, not through manipulation or calculation. Henry folded the letter and looked around the room. There's more, but I think this covers the essential points William wanted to make. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice shaking with rage. This is unacceptable. Jonathan, we need to contest this will immediately. Elena has clearly been manipulating Dad for years, playing the devoted daughter-in-law while planning to steal our inheritance. Rebecca, stop, David said quietly, but his sister ignored him. Look at the facts, Rebecca continued, turning to address the room like she was making a presentation. Elena comes from nothing, marries into our family, and suddenly she's the perfect daughter-in-law. She volunteers to take Dad to his appointments, she spends hours at his house, she acts like his devoted caregiver, and now we find out she's been rewarded with $2 million for her performance? I felt something inside me snap. For 5 years, I had tolerated Rebecca's passive-aggressive comments, her implications about my motives, her treatment of me as a second-class member of the family. But hearing her reduce my genuine love and care for William to a calculated performance was more than I could bear. Rebecca, I said, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me, I'm going to say this once, and then I'm done defending myself to you. I loved your father. Not his money, not his connections, not his social status. I loved the man who taught me how to play chess, who remembered that I preferred tea to coffee, who called me every week just to check on how my students were doing. The fact that you can't understand that kind of relationship without viewing it through the lens of financial gain says everything about you and nothing about me. Rebecca's mouth fell open, clearly not expecting me to fight back. I stood up, feeling calmer than I had in years. Henry, thank you for handling this professionally. I assume you'll be in touch about the logistics of the bequest. Henry nodded. Of course, Elena. There are some documents you'll need to sign, but we can handle that privately. I turned to David, whose expression was unreadable. I'll be at home when you're ready to talk. As I walked toward the door, Jonathan called out, Elena, you know this isn't over. We're going to fight this, and when we're done, everyone will know exactly what kind of person you really are. I turned back to face him, and for the first time in 5 years, I smiled at Jonathan with complete sincerity. Jonathan, I'm looking forward to that, because when this is all over, everyone will know exactly what kind of people you and Rebecca are too, and I think your father was counting on that. I left them sitting in that mahogany-paneled room,
finally understanding that William's bequest wasn't just about giving me financial security. It was about forcing his family to reveal their true characters, to choose between love and money, between acceptance and greed. As I drove home through the late afternoon sunshine, I realized that William had given me something far more valuable than $2 million. He had given me the truth about the family I'd married into and the knowledge that at least one person had seen my worth clearly. The real test was yet to come, and I suspected that before this was over, I would need every ounce of strength and wisdom that William had believed I possessed. But for the first time since I'd married into the Harrison family, I felt like I belonged somewhere, not because I'd been accepted, but because I'd been chosen. The drive home felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every traffic light seemed to last an eternity, giving me too much time to think about the explosion I'd just witnessed and what was waiting for me at home.
My hands were still shaking slightly from the confrontation, but underneath the trembling was something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of my own power. When I pulled into our driveway, the modest two-bedroom house David and I had bought 3 years ago looked smaller than usual, especially knowing that Rebecca's mansion loomed just across town like a monument to her sense of entitlement. But for the first time since we'd moved in, I looked at our little house and felt proud rather than inadequate. We had bought it with our own money, our own credit, our own dreams. No family money, no parental assistance, no inheritance assumptions. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering my thoughts. David would be home soon, and I needed to figure out how to navigate the conversation that was inevitably coming. How do you explain to your husband that his dying father chose you over his own children? How do you make him understand that you never manipulated or schemed for this outcome? The house felt eerily quiet when I walked in. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, staring at the family photos scattered across our coffee table. There was our wedding picture, William beaming as he walked me down the aisle because my own father had passed away years earlier. There was last Christmas, William wearing the ridiculous reindeer sweater I'd bought him, his arm around my shoulders, while Rebecca scowled in the background. There was the photo from David's birthday dinner, William and I deep in conversation about a book we'd both been reading while the rest of the family checked their phones. Looking at these pictures now, I could see what William had seen: genuine affection, real connection, the kind of relationship that develops naturally between people who actually enjoy each other's company. But I could also see what Rebecca and Jonathan had probably seen: their father's attention focused on someone they viewed as an interloper, someone who didn't belong in their family narrative. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Harrison, this is Jennifer Wells from Channel 7 News. We've received information about a controversial inheritance situation involving the Harrison family estate. Would you be available for comment?" I stared at the message in disbelief. Somehow, news of the will reading had already leaked, probably through someone at the law firm or one of the other family members who had been present. The Harrison name carried weight in our community. William's business success and philanthropic activities had made him something of a local celebrity, so I supposed a scandal involving his estate would be considered newsworthy. Before I could decide how to respond, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my stomach clench with anxiety. "Elena," his voice sounded strained and tired. "I'm still at Henry's office. Rebecca and Jonathan have been going through Dad's financial records, trying to find evidence of— I don't know what they think they're going to find. Receipts for brainwashing services?" Despite everything, I found myself smiling at his attempt at humor. "How are you holding up?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what Dad wrote in that letter, about me not defending you when Rebecca and Jonathan said those things. He was right, wasn't he? I always told myself I was keeping the peace, but really, I was just taking the easy way out." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. If David could acknowledge that much, maybe we could navigate this crisis together. "David, your father's letter was harsh because he was trying to make a point, but he also knew that you love me, and he knew that you were caught between your loyalty to me and your desire to maintain family harmony." "But Elena, $2 million. Dad never said anything to me about planning something like this. Did he really discuss it with you beforehand?" I took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment where complete honesty was the only path forward.
Yes, he did. About a month ago, when we were sitting on the porch after one of his chemo treatments. He told me what he was planning, and I tried to talk him out of it. I was terrified of exactly what happened today, that Rebecca and Jonathan would blame me for manipulating him. Why didn't you tell me? David's voice carried a note of hurt that made my chest tighten. Because he asked me not to. He said this decision needed to come from him, and he wanted to be the one to face the consequences. I hated keeping it from you, David, but I'd made a promise to a dying man. I heard David sigh heavily. Rebecca is talking about hiring a lawyer to contest the will. She's convinced that you somehow coerced Dad into this, maybe threatened to stop taking care of him if he didn't change his inheritance plans. The accusation was so ridiculous and so far from the truth that I actually laughed out loud. David, your sister has met me. Do I seem like the kind of person who would threaten a cancer patient? No, of course not. But Elena, you have to understand how this looks from their perspective. Dad leaves his daughter-in-law more money than he left any of his own children, and she happened to be the person spending the most time with him during his final months. Even if your motives were completely pure, the optics are terrible. I felt a flicker of irritation at David's focus on appearances rather than substance. So what are you saying? That I should give the money back to make Rebecca and Jonathan feel better? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I understand why they're upset, and I think we need to find a way to resolve this that doesn't tear the family apart. David, the family was already torn apart. Your father's bequest didn't cause the problems. It exposed them. Rebecca and Jonathan have never accepted me as part of this family, and your father knew that. This inheritance is forcing everyone to be honest about relationships that have been fake for years. My phone beeped with another call coming in. This time it was Rebecca's number. David, your sister's calling me. I should probably take this. Elena, please don't say anything that will make the situation worse. I felt a surge of frustration at his assumption that I would be the one to escalate things. I'll talk to you when you get home. I switched over to Rebecca's call, steeling myself for whatever venom she was about to unleash. Elena, we need to talk. Rebecca's voice was tight with controlled anger. I'm listening.
I want to make you an offer. Jonathan and I have discussed this, and we're prepared to split Dad's bequest with you. You keep $500,000, we split the remaining $1.5 million. Everyone walks away satisfied, and we don't have to drag this family through a public legal battle. I was quiet for so long that Rebecca felt compelled to fill the silence. Elena, this is a generous offer. $500,000 is more money than you'd see in a decade of teaching. You could pay off your student loans, buy a bigger house, maybe even quit working if you wanted to. All you have to do is sign some paperwork acknowledging that Dad wasn't in his right mind when he made this bequest. So you want me to lie about your father's mental state and settle for a quarter of what he intended to give me? I want you to be reasonable about a situation that has gotten out of hand. Dad was sick and emotional and probably felt guilty that we couldn't spend as much time with him as you did. But that doesn't mean his final decisions were sound financial planning. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the garden William had helped me plant last spring. He'd insisted on buying the expensive rose bushes because he said they would bloom for decades if properly cared for. Even then, he'd been thinking about long-term investments and lasting beauty. Rebecca, your father spent 14 months thinking about this decision. He discussed it with his attorney multiple times, he had it reviewed by financial advisors, and he specifically anticipated that you and Jonathan would react exactly the way you're reacting now. This wasn't an impulsive choice made by a sick man, it was a deliberate decision made by someone who knew his children better than they knew themselves. That's ridiculous. Dad would never intentionally create family conflict like this. Wouldn't he? Rebecca, your father was a businessman who understood that sometimes you have to make hard decisions that upset people in the short term to achieve long-term goals. Maybe he decided that it was more important to reward loyalty and kindness than to maintain the illusion of family harmony. I could hear Rebecca's breathing getting heavier as she realized that her attempt at negotiation wasn't working. Elena, I'm trying to handle this civilly, but if you force us to contest this will, things are going to get very ugly very quickly. We'll have to examine every interaction you had with Dad, every conversation, every favor you ever did for him.
We'll have to question your motives, from the Christmas presents you bought him to the way you rearranged his medicine cabinet. The threat was clear, but instead of feeling intimidated, I felt something closer to pity for Rebecca. She was so focused on the money that she couldn't see how her own behavior was proving her father's point. Rebecca, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I didn't ask for this inheritance, I didn't manipulate your father for it, and I didn't scheme to get it. But now that it's been offered to me, I'm not giving it back to make you and Jonathan feel better about yourselves. Your father left me this money because he believed I deserved it, and I'm going to honor his decision by accepting it gracefully. You're making a huge mistake, Elena. Jonathan has connections throughout the legal system, and I know every real estate agent and banker in this town. When we're done with you, your reputation will be destroyed. Are you threatening me, Rebecca? I'm warning you. Dad's money belongs to his family, and we're not going to let some opportunistic outsider steal it just because she played nursemaid for a few months. The casual cruelty of that characterization, reducing my genuine care for William to a calculated performance, finally pushed me past my breaking point. Rebecca, I'm going to give you some free advice. If you and Jonathan decide to contest your father's will, you're going to have to explain to a judge why two successful, financially secure adults believe they're more deserving of their father's money than the person who spent the last months of his life making sure he felt loved and valued. You're going to have to justify why your father's own letter describing your behavior isn't accurate. And you're going to have to do all of this while the entire community watches and judges your character. I took a breath and continued. Your father was one of the most respected men in this town. People knew him as generous, thoughtful, and fair-minded. If you try to paint him as mentally incompetent or easily manipulated, you're not just attacking his final wishes, you're attacking his reputation and his legacy. Are you really prepared to destroy your father's memory to get your hands on money that he deliberately chose not to give you? The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for so long that I wondered if Rebecca had hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. You have no idea what you've just started, Elena, but you're about to find out. The line went dead, and I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, realizing that I had just declared war on the most vindictive and well-connected members of my husband's family. But surprisingly, I didn't feel afraid. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like I was finally being honest about who I was and what I believed in. My phone immediately started buzzing with text messages. 3 more reporters wanting comments, 2 messages from neighbors asking if the rumors they'd heard were true, and 1 text from David's cousin Sarah, who lived in California and had apparently already heard about the family drama through the gossip network. I poured another glass of wine and settled back onto the couch, knowing that David would be home soon and that we were going to have the most difficult conversation of our marriage. But before he arrived, I needed to think strategically about what was coming next. Rebecca and Jonathan weren't going to accept defeat gracefully. They had money, connections, and a sense of entitlement that would drive them to fight this inheritance with every resource at their disposal. But they also had something else, a complete blindness to how their own behavior looked to outsiders. I thought about the letter William had written, specifically his observations about Rebecca's visits and Jonathan's priorities. If they decided to make this a public battle, they would have to explain why their dying father felt compelled to write such a scathing assessment of their characters. They would have to justify why they deserved money more than the person who had actually taken care of him. More importantly, they would have to do all of this while maintaining their standing in a community where William was beloved and respected. Every person who had ever benefited from William's generosity, every business owner who had gotten their start with his help, every charity that had received his donations would be watching to see how his children honored his final wishes. My phone rang again, and this time it was David calling from his car. "I'm about 5 minutes away," he said. "Rebecca and Jonathan are planning to meet with a lawyer tomorrow morning. They want me to join them." "And are you going to?" "I don't know. Elena, I love you, and I believe that you never manipulated Dad. But I also can't stand the thought of our family destroying each other over money." "David, this isn't about money. This is about respect. Your father made a decision that honored the relationship he had with me, and your siblings are trying to invalidate that because they can't accept that someone outside their bloodline might have meant something to him." "I know, but no, David, there's no but here. Either you believe that your father was a competent, loving man who made a thoughtful decision about his estate, or you believe that I'm a manipulative gold digger who took advantage of a sick man. You can't have it both ways. I heard David's car pull into the driveway, and I knew that the next few hours would determine whether our marriage could survive this crisis. "We'll talk when I get inside," David said quietly. I met him at the front door, and the exhaustion on his face made my heart ache. This wonderful man had just lost his father, and instead of being allowed to grieve properly, he was being forced to navigate a family crisis that threatened to tear apart everything he'd always believed about the people he loved.
"How are you doing?" I asked, wrapping him in a hug that he returned with desperate intensity. "I feel like I don't know anything anymore," he said into my shoulder. "I keep thinking about Dad's letter, about the things he said about all of us. Was I really that oblivious to how Rebecca and Jonathan treated you?" I pulled back to look at him. "David, you weren't oblivious. You were trying to maintain relationships with people who were determined to create conflict. There's a difference." We settled onto the couch together, and David reached for my hand. "Tell me everything about your conversation with Dad. I need to understand how this happened." I walked him through that afternoon on the porch. William's concerns about his children's behavior, his observations about my character, and his determination to reward loyalty over biology. I explained how I'd tried to refuse the bequest and how William had insisted that his decision was final and legally binding. "He really said that Rebecca and Jonathan had never accepted you as family?" David asked. "David, you know it's true. In 5 years, how many times has Rebecca invited me to do something without you being there? How many genuine conversations have I had with Jonathan about anything other than polite small talk at family gatherings?" David was quiet for a long time, and I could see him mentally reviewing years of family interactions through this new lens. "I guess I always told myself that they just needed time to warm up to you, that they weren't naturally outgoing with new people. But I'm not new people anymore, David. I've been part of this family for 5 years, and they still treat me like a temporary guest who might leave at any moment." My phone buzzed with another text message, and I glanced at it expecting another reporter. Instead, it was from Maria Santos, who cleaned William's house twice a week and had become something of a friend over the years. "Elena, I heard about Mr. Williams' will. I'm so happy for you. He talked about you all the time, always saying how proud he was that David found such a good woman. Some people are saying you don't deserve it, but those people didn't see how you took care of him when he was sick. You earned every penny." I showed the message to David, and I saw something shift in his expression. "Maria saw how you were with Dad," he said slowly. "She would know better than anyone whether you were genuinely caring for him or just putting on an act. David, there are probably dozens of people who witnessed my relationship with your father over the past 5 years. The nurse at the chemotherapy center, the staff at his doctor's office, the neighbors who saw me coming and going from his house. If Rebecca and Jonathan want to make this a public battle, all of those people will have opinions about whether I deserved this inheritance." My phone rang again, and this time it was Henry Patterson. "Elena, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to give you a heads up about what we can expect over the next few days." "Of course, Henry. What should I be prepared for?" "Well, first of all, news of the will reading has already leaked to the local media. I've had 3 reporters call my office asking for comments about the unusual bequest. I've told them all that client confidentiality prevents me from discussing details, but they're clearly working on a story." I felt my stomach sink. The last thing I wanted was to become the subject of local gossip and speculation. "Second, I expect that Rebecca and Jonathan will indeed hire an attorney to contest the will. They have every legal right to do so, but I want you to know that William anticipated this possibility and took several steps to protect his decision." "What kind of steps?" "He had independent medical evaluations done to confirm his mental competency. He consulted with financial advisors to ensure that the bequest wouldn't create tax problems, and he documented his reasoning extensively. But more than that, he asked me to prepare for the possibility that this inheritance would become a public matter." Henry's voice took on a more serious tone. "Elena, William gave me permission to share certain information if his children chose to make this a legal battle.
Information about their requests for advance distributions from the estate, their discussions about selling family assets, their financial situations, and spending habits. He wanted to make sure that if they questioned your motives, the community would have a complete picture of everyone's behavior. I looked at David, whose eyes had widened with surprise. Henry, are you saying that William was planning for this conflict? I'm saying that William knew his children very well, and he prepared accordingly. Elena, if Rebecca and Jonathan decide to contest this will, they're going to find that your father-in-law was several steps ahead of them. After Henry hung up, David and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what we'd just learned. Dad really was planning this whole thing, David said finally. He didn't just leave you money, he set up a test for all of us. What do you mean? Think about it, Elena. Dad knew that Rebecca and Jonathan would react badly to your inheritance. He knew they'd probably try to contest it, and he knew I'd be caught in the middle. So he prepared evidence that would show everyone's true character if this became a public battle. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what David was suggesting. You think your father wanted this conflict to happen? I think Dad was tired of pretending that our family relationships were healthier than they actually were. And I think he decided that his death would be a good time to force everyone to be honest about who they really are. My phone buzzed with yet another text message, this one from my principal at school asking if I needed to take some time off, given the family situation that was apparently being discussed all over town. David, this is going to affect my job, my reputation, everything. Are you sure you're prepared for what's about to happen? David took my face in his hands and looked directly into my eyes. Elena, I've spent 5 years watching my siblings treat you like you didn't belong in our family. I've spent 5 years taking the easy way out instead of defending the woman I love. And I just spent the afternoon listening to my father's final words about what kind of man I've been. He kissed me gently. So yes, I'm prepared. Rebecca and Jonathan want to fight this? Fine. But they're going to have to go through both of us. For the first time since the will reading, I felt like David and I were truly on the same side. But even as relief washed over me, I knew that the real battle was just beginning. Rebecca and Jonathan had money, connections, and a lifetime of believing that they were entitled to whatever they wanted.
What they didn't have was the truth on their side. And thanks to William's careful planning, the truth was about to become very public indeed. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang at 7:30, displaying a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Harrison, this is Detective Mike Rodriguez with the County Sheriff's Office. I need to speak with you about some allegations that have been made regarding your relationship with William Harrison. I felt the blood drain from my face. What kind of allegations? Ma'am, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Would you be available to come down to the station this morning? David appeared in the kitchen doorway, seeing the panic on my face. I gestured for him to stay quiet while I finished the call. Detective Rodriguez, am I being accused of a crime? At this point, we're just investigating some concerns that have been brought to our attention. You're not under arrest, but we would appreciate your cooperation. After I hung up, David immediately demanded to know what was happening. Rebecca and Jonathan have apparently filed some kind of complaint with the police about my relationship with your father. David's face went white with anger. They called the police? On what grounds? I don't know yet, but I have a feeling we're about to find out just how far your siblings are willing to go to get their hands on that money. I called Henry Patterson, who agreed to meet me at the police station. As we drove there together, I tried to prepare myself for whatever accusations Rebecca and Jonathan had made. But nothing could have prepared me for what Detective Rodriguez told us when we sat down in the small, windowless interview room. Mrs. Harrison, we've received allegations that you may have engaged in financial elder abuse, specifically that you coerced William Harrison into changing his will while he was in a vulnerable state due to his illness. Henry immediately interjected. Detective, I was William Harrison's attorney for over 20 years, and I can assure you that he was completely mentally competent when he made his final will. We have medical documentation to support that. Mr. Patterson, I understand that you represent Mrs. Harrison's interests, but we have to investigate these allegations thoroughly. Mrs. Harrison,
Can you tell me about your relationship with the deceased and any conversations you had about his estate planning? For the next 2 hours, I answered questions about everything, from my marriage to David to my interactions with William during his illness. Detective Rodriguez was professional but thorough, clearly trying to determine whether there was any evidence to support the abuse allegations. Mrs. Harrison, did you ever discuss your financial situation with William Harrison? Did you ever mention debt, financial stress, or need for money? Detective, I'm a high school teacher married to an investment advisor. We live modestly, but we've never been in financial distress. I never asked William for money, and I actually turned down several offers of financial assistance over the years. Can you provide documentation of that? Henry opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Detective, I have records of multiple occasions when William offered to help Elena and David financially. Student loan assistance, down payment help for their house, offers to pay for vacations or home improvements. Elena declined all of these offers. Detective Rodriguez reviewed the documents with interest. Why did you turn down this assistance? Because David and I wanted to build our life together based on our own efforts. We felt it was important to maintain our independence from family money. But you were willing to accept a $2 million inheritance? I felt a flash of anger at the implication. Detective, there's a difference between asking for help and being given a gift by someone who wants to honor your relationship with them. I didn't ask for this inheritance. I tried to talk William out of it, and I only accepted it because it was important to him that I do so. The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from William's mental state during his final months to my knowledge of his family relationships. Finally, Detective Rodriguez seemed satisfied that there was no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Mrs. Harrison, based on our conversation today and the documentation provided by Mr. Patterson, I don't see grounds for pursuing criminal charges related to elder abuse. However, I want you to understand that these allegations will remain on file, and if additional evidence emerges, we may need to reopen this investigation. As Henry and I left the police station, I felt shaken by the realization that Rebecca and Jonathan were willing to accuse me of criminal behavior to get their inheritance back. Elena, Henry said as we walked to our cars, I need you to understand something. This police complaint was just the opening move. Rebecca and Jonathan are going to try to destroy your reputation systematically, hoping that public pressure will force you to give up the inheritance. What do you mean? They're going to tell everyone who will listen that you're a gold digger who manipulated their sick father. They're going to question every act of kindness you showed William, every favor you did for him, every conversation you had with him. They're going to try to turn this community against you. I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what I was facing. Henry, I'm a school teacher. I don't have the resources to fight a public relations battle against people with Rebecca and Jonathan's connections. Henry smiled grimly. Elena, you have something they don't have, the truth. And thanks to William's planning, you also have documentation that will show everyone exactly what kind of people they really are. That afternoon, the first news story appeared online. The headline read, Local businessman's controversial bequest sparks family dispute. The article was carefully worded to avoid legal problems, but the implication was clear. William's daughter-in-law had somehow manipulated him into leaving her a fortune. The article included quotes from family sources, suggesting that I had isolated William from his children and convinced them that they didn't care about him. It mentioned the police investigation and hinted that there might be more revelations to come. By evening, the story had been picked up by 3 more local news outlets, and my phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters wanting my side of the story. David came home from work looking haggard and defeated. Elena, this is all over social media. My coworkers have been asking me about it all day, and I don't know what to tell them. What do you want to tell them? I want to tell them that my father was a smart, loving man who made a decision that honored someone who had been genuinely kind to him. I want to tell them that my siblings are so focused on money that they can't recognize love when they see it.
That evening, as we sat on our couch trying to process the events of the day, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. It was Maria Santos, William's housekeeper. Elena, I've been watching the news about Mr. Williams' will, and I can't stay quiet anymore. I have something you need to see. Maria's voice was shaking with emotion as she continued. I've been cleaning Mr. Williams' house for 8 years, and I recorded some conversations on my phone because I was worried about him when he got sick. I never meant to spy, but sometimes when people think the help doesn't speak English very well, they say things they shouldn't. My heart was pounding as I put the phone on speaker so David could hear. Maria, what kind of conversations? Miss Rebecca and Mr. Jonathan, they came to the house many times when Mr. William was getting his treatments. They would go into his office and look through his papers, talk about selling the house, argue about money. One day, about 6 months ago, I heard Miss Rebecca on the phone with someone, maybe a real estate agent. She said the house would be worth more if they tore it down and built something modern. David's face went pale. While Dad was still living there? Yes, Mr. David. And Mr. Jonathan, he brought some man in a fancy suit to look at Mr. William's art collection. They were taking pictures, writing things down. When Mr. William asked what they were doing, Mr. Jonathan said they were just making sure everything was properly insured. I felt sick to my stomach thinking about Rebecca and Jonathan cataloging their father's possessions like vultures circling a dying animal. Maria, you said you recorded some of these conversations. Yes, I have them on my phone. I was scared that something bad might happen to Mr. William, and I thought maybe someone should know how his children were acting, but I didn't know who to tell. Maria, would you be willing to share those recordings with us? Elena, Mr. William loved you like a daughter. He told me many times that you were the only one who visited him because you wanted to spend time with him, not because you wanted something from him. If these recordings can help people understand the truth, then yes, I want to share them. We arranged to meet Maria the next morning at a coffee shop across town, somewhere we were unlikely to run into anyone from the Harrison family's social circle. David and I barely slept that night, wondering what revelations Maria's recordings might contain. The next morning, Maria arrived at the coffee shop carrying an old Android phone and looking nervous but determined. She was a small woman in her 50s who had emigrated from El Salvador 20 years earlier and built a successful cleaning business through hard work and absolute integrity. Before I show you these, Maria said, I want you to understand something. I loved Mr. William like family. He helped my son get into college, he gave me bonuses every Christmas, and he treated me with respect even when other people in his house didn't. She glanced meaningfully at David, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. I knew that Rebecca and Jonathan had always treated Maria like she was invisible, addressing her only to give orders and never bothering to learn about her family or her life outside their father's house. Now, I'm going to show you what his real children were doing while you, Elena, were taking care of him. Maria pulled up the first recording on her phone and hit play. We heard Rebecca's voice clearly, apparently talking on the phone while she thought she was alone in William's house. No, Mother's jewelry is still in the bedroom safe, but I think we should move it to my house for security. Dad's so out of it with the pain medication that he probably wouldn't even notice. What do you mean I need his permission? He's not going to live much longer, and Elena's always hanging around here. I don't trust her not to help herself to things. David's jaw dropped as he listened to his sister casually discussing stealing from their father while he was still alive. The recording continued with Rebecca talking about which pieces of furniture would fit in her house and which items should be sold immediately after William's death to avoid having to split the proceeds with her brothers. The second recording was even worse. It was Jonathan's voice, apparently talking to the man in the expensive suit that Maria had mentioned. Dad's got maybe 3 months left, 6 at the outside. The Picasso sketch alone is worth about $200,000, but we'll need to get it appraised quickly after he dies. The problem is going to be my youngest brother's wife. She's gotten very close to Dad, and I'm worried she might try to claim that some of these pieces were promised to her. We heard another man's voice, presumably the appraiser. Has your father made any recent changes to his will? Not that I know of, but Elena's got him wrapped around her little finger. I wouldn't be surprised if she tries to manipulate him into leaving her something substantial. We need to be prepared to challenge anything that looks suspicious.
I felt like I was going to be sick listening to Jonathan plotting against me months before William had even mentioned the inheritance. These recordings proved that Rebecca and Jonathan had been suspicious of my motives and planning to contest any bequest to me long before they knew such a bequest existed. But Maria wasn't done. She played a third recording that made me understand why William had been so determined to leave me that money. It was a conversation between Rebecca and Jonathan that had apparently taken place in William's kitchen while he was napping upstairs and I was at work. I still think we should talk to Dad about Elena, Rebecca was saying. She's here too much, she's inserting herself into family business, and I don't trust her motives. Jonathan's voice was cold and calculating. The problem is that Dad genuinely likes her, which makes this more complicated. If we push too hard, he might dig in his heels and leave her more than we want him to. So what do you suggest? We need to document everything. Every time she comes to the house, every conversation she has with Dad, every favor she does for him. If she does end up with any significant inheritance, we'll need evidence that she manipulated him to get it. Rebecca laughed bitterly.
It's perfect, isn't it? She probably thinks she's being the dutiful daughter-in-law, but she's actually building our case for us every time she shows up here with soup or offers to drive Dad to another appointment. The callousness of that statement, the idea that my genuine care for William was somehow evidence of manipulation, made me understand why William had been so angry in his letter to his children. Maria had one more recording, and this one featured a voice I hadn't expected to hear. "David, you need to talk to your wife about boundaries." It was Jonathan, apparently having a phone conversation with my husband. "Dad's getting too dependent on Elena, and it's not healthy for any of them." David's voice came through clearly, and I felt my heart sink as I heard what he said next. "Jonathan, I know Elena spends a lot of time with Dad, but she genuinely cares about him. I don't think there's any hidden agenda." "David, think about this logically. Elena comes from nothing, she's married into a wealthy family, and now she's positioning herself as Dad's primary caregiver. You don't think there's any chance that she's thinking about her future financial security?" There was a long pause before David responded, and when he did, his words cut me to the bone. "I mean, I don't think Elena would deliberately manipulate Dad, but I suppose it's possible that she doesn't realize how her behavior might be perceived. Maybe I should talk to her about stepping back a little." I stared at David, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor of the coffee shop. "Elena, You actually considered the possibility that I was using your father?" I said quietly. "Even for a moment, you thought maybe your siblings were right about me?" "Elena, I was trying to keep the peace. Jonathan was putting pressure on me, and I didn't want family conflict." "So you were willing to ask me to abandon your dying father to keep your brother happy?" David's face crumpled with shame. "I'm sorry. I should have told Jonathan what he was completely out of line, and I should have defended you without hesitation. Dad was right about me in that letter. I chose avoiding conflict over protecting the person I love." Maria reached across the table and patted my hand. "Miss Elena, Mr. William heard about this conversation. Your husband never actually talked to you about stepping back, did he?" I looked at David, who shook his head miserably. "No, he didn't. But how did William know about it?" Maria smiled sadly. "Mr. Jonathan called your house one evening when Mr. William was there having dinner. Mr. William answered the phone, and he heard Mr. Jonathan asking David if he had talked to you yet about the situation. Mr. William put the pieces together and realized that his children had been conspiring against you." I felt a wave of understanding wash over me as I realized that William's inheritance decision hadn't been made in a vacuum. He had known that his own children were plotting against me, that they viewed my kindness as manipulation, and that even David was susceptible to their pressure. "Mr. William was so angry that night," Maria continued. "He said that you were the only person in the family who treated him like a human being instead of a bank account, and he wasn't going to let his children destroy you for having a good heart." David looked devastated as the full implications of William's knowledge sank in. Dad knew that I had doubts about Elena's motives, and he knew that I didn't defend her when Jonathan questioned her character. Yes, Mr. David, and that's why he wrote that letter about you not standing up for your wife. He wanted you to understand what your silence cost. I took a deep breath, processing everything we had learned. Maria, would you be willing to share these recordings with William's attorney? Of course. Mr. William asked me to keep records of what happened in his house during his illness. I think he knew that someday there might be questions about who really cared about him. That afternoon, we met with Henry Patterson and played Maria's recordings. His reaction was immediate and decisive. Elena, these recordings completely destroy any claim that Rebecca and Jonathan might make about your motives or behavior. They prove that your in-laws were planning to contest any bequest to you before they even knew such a bequest existed. More than that, they show a pattern of behavior that validates everything William wrote in his letter. Henry leaned back in his chair, looking almost eager for the legal battle ahead. Rebecca and Jonathan have made a serious tactical error by filing that police complaint and talking to the media. They've opened themselves up to public scrutiny of their own behavior, and now we have documentation of exactly what that behavior looked like. What does this mean for the will contest? David asked. It means that if Rebecca and Jonathan want to pursue this legally, they're going to have to explain to a judge why they were discussing their father's death and planning to dispose of his possessions while he was still alive. They're going to have to justify why they viewed Elena's kindness as manipulation while they were literally plotting to challenge any inheritance she might receive. Henry pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. More importantly, these recordings demonstrate that William's bequest was not the result of undue influence. It was a direct response to his children's behavior. Elena, your father-in-law wasn't manipulated into leaving you money. He was protecting you from people who had already decided to view you as an enemy. Over the next week, Henry worked with Maria to have the recordings professionally authenticated and transcribed. Meanwhile, the media coverage of our family dispute continued to grow, with Rebecca and Jonathan giving interviews that portrayed them as victims of their stepmother's manipulation. Rebecca appeared on the local morning show, tears streaming down her face, as she talked about how difficult it was to lose her father, and then discovered that a family outsider had convinced him to disinherit his own children. Elena isolated our father from his family during the most vulnerable time of his life, Rebecca said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She convinced him that we didn't care about him, and then she exploited his emotional state to secure a massive inheritance. It breaks my heart to think that Dad died believing his own children had abandoned him. Jonathan took a different approach, appearing on a local radio show to discuss the legal and ethical issues surrounding contested wills. Elder abuse is a serious problem in our society, he said, in his most professional attorney voice. When someone in a position of trust uses their access to a vulnerable elderly person to secure financial benefits, that's exactly the kind of behavior our legal system is designed to prevent. My sister and I aren't fighting this will because we're greedy. We're fighting it to protect other elderly people from similar exploitation. The interviews were effective in shaping public opinion, at least initially. I started getting cold stares at the grocery store and uncomfortable silence when I walked into restaurants where I was known. Several of my students' parents requested meetings with my principal to discuss whether it was appropriate for someone under investigation for elder abuse to be teaching their children. But Henry had been preparing for this phase of the battle. A week after Rebecca and Jonathan's media appearances, he held a press conference that changed the entire narrative. Standing on the steps of the courthouse with Maria beside him, Henry addressed a crowd of reporters and community members. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to present evidence that completely contradicts the allegations made against Elena Harrison. What you're about to hear will demonstrate that Elena was not manipulating William Harrison. She was being victimized by family members who viewed her kindness as a threat to their inheritance expectations. Henry played carefully selected portions of Maria's recordings, focusing on the conversations where Rebecca and Jonathan discussed their father's death as a business opportunity and plotted to challenge any bequest to me before they knew such a bequest existed. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The crowd of community members who had gathered to hear the press conference began murmuring angrily as they listened to Rebecca discussing moving her father's jewelry while he was still alive. When Jonathan's voice came through the speakers, talking about getting the artwork appraised quickly after William's death, several people shook their heads in disgust. But the recording that had the biggest impact was the conversation between Rebecca and Jonathan, where they laughed about how my visits to care for William were actually building their case for claiming I had manipulated him. These recordings prove that Elena Harrison's kindness toward her father-in-law was genuine, and that his bequest to her was a direct response to his awareness of his own children's behavior, Henry concluded. William Harrison wasn't a confused old man who was manipulated by his daughter-in-law. He was a sharp, observant father who understood exactly what kind of people his children had become. Maria stepped forward to the microphone, her voice shaking with emotion, but her words clear and strong. I worked for Mr. William for 8 years, and I saw how each member of his family treated him. Miss Rebecca and Mr. Jonathan visited their father when they needed something, money, connections, or information about his estate. But Elena visited because she loved him. She brought him books, she listened to his stories, she held his hand during the scary medical procedures. Mr. William knew the difference between someone who cared about him and someone who cared about his money. The press conference was covered by every major news outlet in the region, and the public response was swift and decisive. Within hours, social media was flooded with comments supporting me and condemning Rebecca and Jonathan's behavior. The local morning show that had featured Rebecca's tearful interview issued a public apology and offered me an opportunity to tell my side of the story. The radio station where Jonathan had appeared as an expert on elder abuse ran a follow-up segment questioning whether someone who had plotted against their own father could be considered a reliable authority on family ethics. But the most satisfying response came from the Millbrook Community Foundation, where William had served on the board for 15 years. The foundation issued a public statement that read, in part, "William Harrison was one of the most generous and thoughtful individuals ever to serve our organization. The idea that he could be manipulated or confused about his own values and priorities is insulting to his memory. The foundation stands behind his final wishes and commends Elena Harrison for her dedication to Mr. Harrison during his illness." The statement was signed by 12 prominent community leaders, including the mayor, the president of the largest bank in town, and the senior pastor of the church where William had been a member for over 30 years. Rebecca and Jonathan's legal strategy began to crumble as quickly as their public relations campaign. Their attorney withdrew from the case after the recordings were released, apparently unwilling to argue in court that a man who had been sharp enough to run a successful business until 6 months before his death was somehow too confused to make decisions about his estate. 2 weeks later, Henry received a phone call that ended the entire dispute. "Elena," he said when he called to give me the news, "Rebecca and Jonathan's new attorney wants to schedule a meeting to discuss a settlement." "What kind of settlement?" "They're willing to drop all legal challenges to the will in exchange for your agreement not to pursue any claims against them for defamation or harassment." I thought about everything that had happened over the past month: the police investigation, the media attacks, the damage to my reputation and career. Rebecca and Jonathan had tried to destroy me to get their hands on money that their father had deliberately chosen not to give them. "Henry, what would William want me to do?" "I think William would want you to accept his gift gracefully and use it to build the kind of life he believed you deserved. He didn't leave you that money to create a legal battle. He left it because he wanted you to be secure and independent." The settlement meeting took place in Henry's conference room, the same space where the will had been read just 6 weeks earlier. Rebecca and Jonathan arrived with their new attorney, looking subdued and defeated in a way that was completely different from their confident arrogance during the will reading. Their lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 60s, got straight to the point. "My clients are prepared to withdraw all challenges to William Harrison's will and to issue public statements acknowledging that they were mistaken about Elena Harrison's relationship with their father. In exchange, Mrs. Harrison agrees not to pursue legal action for defamation, harassment, or intentional infliction of emotional distress." Henry looked at me, and I nodded. "We're prepared to accept that settlement," Henry said. Rebecca spoke for the first time since we'd sat down.
Elena, I want you to know that I never meant for things to get so out of hand. I was grieving and angry, and I said things that weren't true. I studied her face, looking for genuine remorse, but what I saw was mostly embarrassment and defeat. Rebecca, I understand that you were upset about your father's will, but you accused me of criminal behavior, you tried to destroy my reputation, and you made David choose between his family and his wife. I'm accepting the settlement because William wanted me to focus on building a positive future, not because I forgive the way you and Jonathan treated me. Jonathan had remained silent throughout the meeting, but as we prepared to leave, he looked directly at me for the first time. Elena, my father obviously saw something in you that we missed. I hope you use his gift well. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that William's decision had been valid and thoughtful. 3 months later, I was sitting in the garden that William had helped me plant, watching David install a new bird feeder that we'd bought with a tiny fraction of the inheritance money. The rest of the $2 million was safely invested, providing us with a security and independence that would have been impossible on our teaching and investment advisor salaries. But more than the financial freedom, William's bequest had given me something even more valuable, the knowledge that I had been seen and appreciated for exactly who I was. In a family where I had often felt like an outsider, one person had recognized my worth and chosen to honor it in the most concrete way possible. David had changed too. The crisis had forced him to examine his own behavior and to understand that neutrality in the face of injustice is actually a form of complicity. He had started attending family therapy sessions to work through his tendency to avoid conflict, and he had made a commitment to stand up for our relationship even when it meant disappointing his siblings. Rebecca and Jonathan had issued the public statements required by our settlement agreement, acknowledging that they had been wrong about my relationship with their father and apologizing for any harm their accusations had caused. But their apologies felt hollow, and I suspected they were motivated more by legal necessity than genuine remorse. We saw them at William's grave on the anniversary of his death, placing expensive flower arrangements while David and I sat on the bench where William and I had shared our last conversation about the inheritance. They nodded politely but didn't approach us, and I was grateful for the distance. As I sat in my garden that afternoon, I thought about the letter William had left to be read at the will reading. He had written about wanting to reward loyalty and kindness over biology and entitlement. But more than that, he had wanted to teach his family a lesson about the difference between loving someone and using them. Rebecca and Jonathan had learned that lesson, though probably not in the way William had hoped. They had discovered that their calculating approach to family relationships had cost them not just money, but the respect of their community and their own integrity. David had learned it too, understanding finally that love requires courage, the courage to defend the people who matter to you, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. And I had learned something as well. I had learned that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is accept love when it's offered to you, even if it comes with complications and challenges. William had been right about me. I was practical, but he had also understood something that it took me months to fully appreciate. Sometimes the practical choice is to believe that you deserve good things and to have the courage to accept them when they come your way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.